You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. When a group of European worthies, led by a French aristocrat, Pierre de Coubertin, resurrected the Olympic Games of ancient Greece and dragged them into the modern world at the end of the 19th century, the language around the Games was marinated in idealism. Expressed this way by Coubertin himself, the important thing in life is not the triumph, but the struggle. The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well. It sounds even better in French. The early Olympic Games were played in a world of empires. There were few countries participating compared to today. Just 1,200 athletes competed in 19 sports in Paris in 1900. Coming to Paris in 2024, 10,000 athletes competing in more than 300 events in more than 30 sports. The Olympic ideal of fair play, of harmony between nations, of high-minded amateurism has taken a beating in the last century, and yet here we are, getting ready for another Olympiad, with Russian and Belarusian athletes playing with no flag and anthem, continued suspicions about doping in other delegations, and amateur sports? In the most popular events, we pulled that Band-Aid off a long time ago. John Hoberman is a professor of Germanic studies at the University of Texas in Austin. His work in sports takes in race relations, politics in the Olympics, and performance-enhancing drug use. Hoberman is the author of Sport and Political Ideology, The Olympic Crisis, Sport, Politics, and the Moral Order, and Dopers in Uniform. He's been published by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy. Professor, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Very good to be here.
Well, once again, the fairness of the Olympic Games is being questioned. In 2021, at the postponed Tokyo Games, 23 top Chinese athletes were found to have doped. Nearly half of the Chinese swimming team medaled, but they faced little scrutiny. And some of those same swimmers will compete in Paris. Did China escape necessary scrutiny?
I believe they did, and that this is typical in the big geopolitical world of global sports politics, because every sports ambitious dictatorship in the post-war period, and we're talking about the Soviet Union, East Germany, China, and Russia, has had a state-sponsored doping program. And they get away with it because the International Olympic Committee, which imagines itself to be a peace movement, operates on the principle that in order for them to save the world, every single nation on earth must participate, no matter how criminal or monstrous the regime happens to be. The other factor is that the Russians and the Chinese, huge authoritarian countries, especially from a sports standpoint, are contributing many talented people, many medal winners to the Olympic Games. And so that there is that incentive for the IOC to soft pedal or look the other way, disregard the obvious massive doping crimes of these regimes. I mean, in the state-sponsored doping in China in the 80s and 90s is a matter of historical record. But the reaction from the IOC and from the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, which it helped to create back in 1999, has really been very weak. They operate on the principle that they simply cannot expel big Olympic players, even if they operate state-sponsored doping programs and are outed as having done so. The big example of this in the last decade is the massive, complicated Sochi Winter Olympics 2014 doping scandal that involved the Russian anti-doping agency, Putin's agents, the Secret Service, doctors, scientists, athletes, et cetera, et cetera. This was exposed in December of 2014, and thanks to the president of the IOC, Thomas Bach, who has been a political friend of Vladimir Putin. We saw them with their arms around each other at the end of the Sochi Games. Thanks to Bach, despite the fact that Putin's regime had humiliated the IOC, had humiliated the World Anti-Doping Agency by pulling off this stunt and winning a ton of gold medals that sent Putin's poll ratings skywards, which encouraged the annexation of Crimea a few days after the end of the Games. And remember, the IOC calls itself a peace movement.
For the various reasons that you cite, China is now an even bigger player than Russia on the world stage. It's 1/6 of humanity. In a very deliberate way, in recent decades, it's become a sporting powerhouse. In very recent games, it's been a multiple host of the games, winter and summer. It would be a big bite to keep China excluded, wouldn't it? I mean, that's a lot to ask.
It is a lot to ask. And the question is whether anyone is going to take your anti-doping rhetoric seriously if you wind up choosing the participation of the sports superpower, regardless of whether or not they keep producing these squads of doped athletes. And as a matter of fact, they have specialized in doped swimmers. So that this was a huge scandal regarding Chinese swimmers in the early 1990s. And so what you have now is a situation where the Chinese wind up sitting on these positive tests of the heart drug, which is an illicit drug, according to the anti-doping authorities. They sit on that for a few years, and then the New York Times breaks it recently. And one of the things we learn is that the World Anti-Doping Agency has taken the Chinese officials at their word, that 23 Chinese swimmers wound up with this illicit substance in their bodies because something went wrong down in the kitchen at a restaurant that was preparing meals that they were all eating. But, that's the comic part. The non-comic part is that when the World Anti-Doping Agency said, fine, these 23 Chinese swimmers pass muster, they didn't do anything wrong, there's no evidence that they committed a doping violation. They didn't mention, of course, the state-sponsored Chinese doping scandals of the 80s and the 90s. And how can you make that sort of a decision? How much self-deceptive folly are you going to indulge in order to say in 2024, well, if Chinese sports officials tell us that 23 swimmers have been, tainted by misbehavior in a hotel kitchen, I mean, you can't do that and take these people seriously. They feel hamstrung by the need, as you pointed out, to keep the Chinese in.
But China also, like many other countries, is a little bit of a black box. Even if there was a public display of what was called transparency, and people were invited into labs from the World Anti-Doping Agency and so on, would you really trust that there was not at the same time an underground lab with a second set of samples cooking up various substances for athletes in various endurance and other sports to ingest? I mean, some of this has to go on the honor system, doesn't it?
A very great deal goes on the honor system. And one of the circumstantial set of data that people really don't know, and that the big agencies, the International Olympic Committee, the World Anti-Doping Agency, the International Testing Agency that was created in 2018, it's kind of a support to WADA. When you look at the number of positive tests that these groups have turned up in their well-equipped laboratories, over about 50 years, the IOC record of catching dopers at the Olympic Games between 1968 and 2021 is 0.25%. When WADA spends tens of millions testing samples from around the world in Montreal, you look at the 10-year record, you're looking at positive rates of around 1%. The world of sport, of global sport, operates on the presumption that there is a global anti-doping system. And there is. And tens of millions of dollars, which of course are not anything like what would be required to be more effective. The world operates on the assumption that global anti-doping control is actually happening. What these agencies do not publicize are the data that I just recited for you. They are catching practically nobody. Any informed observer of the world of high-performance sport these days knows that in certain sports, in a lot of sports actually, the prevalence of doping is much, much higher than 1%. If you look at the Lance Armstrong tour of, say, 20 years ago, my guess is there would have been a literal handful of guys who were not doping. All right? So that everybody knew that if you were not on your blood booster, you didn't have a chance. And of course, Armstrong is finally confessing on TV to Oprah Winfrey at the beginning of 2013. And what a disaster for the reputation of sport that was. Now, of course, professional cycling continues. The 2024 tour is on now. And guess what? The latest problem that the International Cycling Federation has to deal with regard to cheating is tiny motors that cyclists are hiding in the bicycles in order to give them an extra boost. And so that when you test at the Tour de France these days, you are not simply testing for, say, blood boosters or steroids. You are taking a so-called magnetic tablet and you are running it over the bike to see if you can detect a tiny motorized device that is the latest thing in professional cycling cheating. That is where we are. You know, the cliche, which is true, is that it's a cat and mouse game.
The real sympathy has to go for any athlete who's trying to play clean, because it creates an immediately tainted competition. And certainly in the case of swimming, there's been squawking from the U.S. equivalent of WADA, USADA, the U.S. anti-doping agency. American swimmers are complaining about the fairness of the events in Paris because of the participation of the Chinese. Where does this leave the athlete who wants to play it straight?
Well, this leaves the athlete who is the conscientious objector to doping, and there are lots of them, of course, in a very unfair position. I mean, we can still read interviews with American female swimmers who were cheated out of medals at the 1976 Montreal Summer Olympic Games by East Germans who, of course, were doping. I mean, you can look up the doses of a lot of East German athletes, some of whom, by the way, still hold world records that are unchallenged by their international federations. So that there's a great deal of talking about the realities of doping that doesn't happen. So that in order to keep the sports entertainment business going, you cannot make an effort to have a realistic and honest and out front public discussion of how much doping there is, how little of it is caught, how the incentives to dope are built into the system, and the enormous amount of corruption at the international level, where you have an IOC that was pretending to do drug testing that started in 1968 and, of course, was catching a fraction of a percent. And they were fine with that. When the 1980 Moscow Games produced 0 positive drug tests, the IOC didn't make a peep. That's the real problem. The real problem is it's at this global political level where you have institutions like the International Olympic Committee, like the World Anti-Doping Agency, that get away with running this enormous show. And the IOC bases its acceptance of authoritarian regimes that commit terrible crimes the way Putin does. And then he commits a doping crime on his own soil in Sochi. And guess who is at the Rio Olympic Games only 2 years later? Russian athletes. And this has been expedited by the president of the International Olympic Committee, who was Putin's great sports political friend until February of 2022. And what the IOC president realized when Putin sends 100,000 plus soldiers into Ukraine and commits war crime after war, this is when the president of the IOC realized that he had to give up his political friendship with Vladimir Putin because it was costing too much.
One part of all of this that we sometimes haven't spoken about in recent Olympic Games is the repurposed, modernized tradition of the Olympic truce. The Greek city-states that competed against each other in the Games stopped their wars, and they were constantly fighting against each other. They stopped their wars for the period of the Games. And right now, as you say, Russia is in Ukraine. Israel is in the occupied territories trying to wipe out Hamas. And these countries will participate in Paris with no truce. There will be no cease to the fighting in either the Gaza Strip or in Ukraine or in many other places in the world, Myanmar and others that are in active hostilities right at the moment. The International Olympic Committee gave Russia and its BFF Belarus a little slap on the wrist, basically said, well, we're only going to allow a tiny part of your normal delegations to come, and they won't be able to compete as Russian and Belarusian athletes. They'll have to compete under a neutral flag, and there'll be no anthems when they win, and so on. Only 36 athletes were invited from Russia. 16 accepted the invitation. You've already told us what you thought about the fact that they're coming at all. Do you think there was pressure from the top not to compete? You know, it takes years to prepare for an Olympics, and only 16 Russians accepted the invitation out of 36 invited. What do you think is going on there?
I think pressure from the top can be assumed. I mean, that's Vladimir Putin's political way of life. But there are certain things that we have to keep in mind. First of all, Vladimir Putin and his agents have been for months waging a cyber attack campaign against the Paris Olympiad. He got used to being treated as a favorite by the IOC, and then his crimes in Ukraine have made that politically impossible. And so he is angry at these people. But Putin's agents are actively promoting disinformation that is trying to frighten people away from the Paris Games. He has had this relationship in stages with the IOC. Everything was fine up until the Sochi Games, and then he betrays the IOC in WADA with this enormous doping scandal. But even there, as you point out, the IOC wrist slaps Putin and he has hundreds of people in Rio for the 2016 Summer Olympic Games. Then, and as a matter of fact, in 2020, the Court for Arbitration of Sport, which is the Supreme Court of international sport, cut the Russian ban from world sports events that the anti-doping agency had proclaimed in 2019. They cut it in half. Why did they do that? I would love to have a transcript of the telephone calls that went between the IOC office in Lausanne and the Court for Arbitration office in Lausanne. So the first stage is happiness. Putin goes to Guatemala City in 2007 and gets the IOC's approval to stage the Sochi Games. Then comes Sochi, and the IOC reacts, but they do not act with anything like the strength or the conviction that they should. The World Anti-Doping Agency is more or less forced to follow suit. And then you come to the third phase, and that is the horror show in Ukraine that Putin initiates in February of 2022. At that point, Putin's erstwhile friend, the president of the IOC, realizes that this particular game is over for the time being. And you mentioned there's going to be very small numbers of Russian athletes showing up in Paris. The Russian and Belarusian athletes, and we're only talking about 2 or 3 dozen people, nobody who has quote unquote actively supported the war in Ukraine will be eligible. Athletes who are contracted to the Russian or Belarusian military or national security agencies will not be eligible. And then there is the absence of the flag and the anthem, etc. And by the way, you mentioned a farcical Olympic truce idea. When Thomas Bach, president of the IOC, in his first statement with regard to Putin's war in early 2022, he accused Putin not of a brutal military operation or crime or anything like that. Thomas Bach waved his finger at Vladimir Putin and said, "You have violated the Olympic truce," because technically Putin had the temerity to invade Ukraine during what was officially the Olympic truce of early 2022.
Well, looking over the long history of the Games, in your formidable scholarship in this area, you've made the argument that no matter how much we try, we can't separate politics from the Olympic Games. Certainly, everybody remembers Hitler's Olympics in 1936, from Cold War politics in the post-war era, decades, as we've been discussing, of state-sponsored doping, to arguing that human rights abuses should cause the disinvitation of a delegation from the Games. The Olympics are always kind of mired in these kinds of controversies. Should there be a single rule of thumb, a single set of standards that gets you a clean bill of health for participating in International Olympics that gets applied simply to everyone who wants to play?
Well, if I ran this zoo, I would take what I think is a more or less practical approach and say that authoritarian regimes are not welcome. And one of the reasons is that they have a decades-long track record of corrupting Olympic sport by virtue of establishing state-sponsored doping programs. These people have no consciences. The people who run the major international federations, and I don't care what they are, well, maybe I'd make an exception, World Athletics and Sebastian Coe. But so many of these people are cynical political operatives. They are in it to get their names in the paper. They're in it for the power that they can exercise on the global sports scene. The world of high-performance international sport is an ethics-free zone. That is what people have to understand. That is the conceptual framework that I've used for the past 40 whatever years in order to try to understand the behavior of these people. And it is a framework that I continue to find useful. You mentioned the Nazi Olympics of 1936. This is what started it. This was the first spectacular and hugely politically advantageous Olympiad. I mean, there are serious historians who say that if the United States had boycotted and taken a number of other nations with it, that Hitler's triumph at the 1936 Berlin Games would have been kneecapped in a way that actually might have altered his behavior prior to the invasion of Poland at the beginning of September 1939. These are the kind of stakes that serious people can think about when they think about, well, does it matter whether the IOC accords the right to put on the games to this or that regime? Now, if you start with 1936, when you look at the historical record, the fact is the IOC has never met an authoritarian regime it did not want to do business with, ever. And that includes, by the way, the Mexican government in 1968, the pre-government, the one-party democracy bit And here is one of the least known facts of Olympic history. 10 days prior to the October 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City, they started on October the 12th. On October the 2nd, 1968, the Mexican military slaughtered several hundred people in the heart of Mexico. This is the Tlatelolco massacre of October 2nd, which still traumatizes Mexico to some degree. The IOC has never said a word about that. The IOC does not want to be associated with any of this. Is the greatest Olympic crime ever.
Let's even ante up a little bit more on the Mexico Games. You note the slaughter, and it was a largely young crowd, many of them university students, killed in Mexico City. And just a handful of days later was the opening ceremony of the Games, release of the doves and burning of the cauldron and all of that. During that Olympics, Tommie Smith and John Carlos don black gloves, top the podium after the 200-meter sprint finals, and give the Black Power salute. The United States had just been through a couple of summers of sweltering racial violence across urban America. The Special Investigative Commission, the Kerner Commission, had been authorized by Lyndon Johnson to try to figure out what was going on. And Avery Brundage, who was an incredibly right-wing guy for a head of a national sports authority, instead of banning Mexico City, or at least even slapping them on the wrist or spanking them with something about massacring their own students, they took away Tommie Smith and John Carlos's medals and immediately cleared them out of the Olympic Village. The United States was very much hand in glove with a lot of the most retrograde decisions made around Olympic sport for decades. I mean, there's some not very proud history involved here, isn't there?
And as a matter of fact, the sports has nothing to do with politics and ethics argument, originates with Avery Brundage. And it is being used to this day over and over again by Thomas Bach, the president of the IOC, who has to explain to the world why the Uyghur genocide in China doesn't matter, and that China, the Chinese games should go on regardless of what crimes are being committed on whatever scale on Chinese soil. The Ukraine war was a bridge too far, even for the IOC that has had this authoritarian-friendly tradition that you can document for decade after decade, and that comes to some sort of a conclusion with Putin's crimes in Ukraine.
Well, given the twin subjects of our discussion and your twin areas of academic expertise and inquiry, the doping and the politics, what will you be watching and watching for in Paris to close?
That's a hard question. Well, for one thing, one wonders whether the political crisis in France is going to somehow impact the games. One wonders whether the River Seine is going to be clean enough for people to swim in. The bets as of today are off on that. I would certainly be interested in monitoring the propaganda that comes out of Moscow and the mouth of Vladimir Putin with regard to the games. Putin is interested in the games as a political instrument. They have, in effect, been taken away from him on this occasion, and this is a unique occasion.
John Hoberman is a professor at the University of Texas, Austin. His work includes sport and political ideology and the Olympic crisis, sport, politics, and the moral order. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Many thanks for your invitation.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED. with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jarrett Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.